discourse as the last Tasmanian, you know, the sort of tragic, the tragic last victim of a process that was really very unfortunate, but, you know, not our fault. We didn't do it. It happened a long time ago. I really want to rescue her from that. I really want to rescue her from that, all the myth making that's gone on around her, and consider a woman who survived to a ripe old age, living entirely on her own terms. I mean, this is a 19th century First Nations woman. She doesn't become somebody's pet. She doesn't become somebody's trophy. She doesn't become somebody's servant. She stays very much her own woman, and as much as is humanly possible within the apocalyptic disaster that overwhelms her people, she manages to live a traditional life. I think this is pretty extraordinary. I think she is a remarkable woman, and that my book is very much about celebrating that about her. If you haven't seen a copy of it, it's got this spectacular cover, which you might see behind me also on the wall is the original Peter Dombrowska's photograph of the kelp forests off the west coast of Tasmania. Her country extends to the west coast of Tasmania. She had kin relationships with the clans from the west coast and spent quite a lot of time there. And my book spends time with her on the west coast and on those, by those kelp forests. And it seems that it's a marvelous kind of metaphor for the extraordinary turbulence of what happened to a people who had been living in Tasmania for millennia. How many? 40,000 years? Perhaps only 20. Certainly 20,000 years, 10,000 years since they were cut off from the rest of Australia. They certainly had been there for a bloody long time. I mean, it's just, you can't begin to imagine how long that is without any kind of major interruption except the rising of the sea that cut them off. And suddenly, within a very short period of time, this world is completely destroyed. And basically it happens within her lifetime. So by the time she's born, it has begun, and she is the person who marks the end of it. And I hesitated for some time to talk about this being a genocide, but really there is no other way to look at it. And also, no matter how much we may celebrate the resurgence of Aboriginality in Tasmania, there is no getting away from the enormity of what happened here in Tasmania. And I focus on Truganini because she's personally important to me, but also because it's her life that frames this terrible moment in time. There's nothing like it, you know, in modern history. There's nothing so complete, so dreadful as what happened in Tasmania. And at the same time as acknowledging that, I didn't want to write a book that was all about horror and terror and loss. I wanted to write a book about the survivors, and there were a number of them who managed to make a life within this apocalypse, and she is the one who lasts the longest. So in many ways, this is a group biography too. I'm talking about other people who, in particularly her first husband, Werribee, who also make this kind of accommodation with the apocalypse. They negotiate a way of living within that. And they are, I know this, and I know about them because the person who facilitates that is this strange man called George Augustus Robinson, who was my ancestor's neighbour and friend. And he is the person who hits upon the bright idea that he can take the few people who remained from the pandemic disease that destroyed the Nuenonne on Bruny Island. That's Truganini were ready's 2 children, with him to the West Coast to conciliate the Aboriginal people who are living there without pandemic disease, without murder, without their wives and daughters being stolen by the sealers to become their slaves, and persuade them that the government will look after them. And he does this. He walks around Tasmania for nearly 6 years, and on this, what he calls his friendly missions, to meet with and conciliate the remaining clans of Tasmania. And he uses Truganini and a handful of her friends from other clans to do that. And the best thing about George Augustus Robinson, remarkable man, one of the most interesting figures in colonial history, is that he keeps very extensive daily journals. And he really is very interested in these Aboriginal people who are travelling with him. He really cares about them and he pays a lot of attention to them. And so consequently, I'm able to see them in a way you just don't see Indigenous people in the 19th century. And so that gave me the basis for being able to create a world and populate these people in this world. So, Jay has a question?
No, I just, she seemed to be unmuted for a moment. It's okay. Anything in the background of everyone's things, if they're unmuted, will, so I must have accidentally tapped the unmute button, but it's back now. We're back now.
Okay, so I don't want to talk too much about it. I'm much more interested in answering people's questions about it. But I do want to emphasize that I feel that Truganini has been badly served by history and by the way in which she has been turned into this kind of symbol of being a tragic victim. The stories that are told about her are always about her being raped, or her husband being murdered, or her mother being murdered, or her sisters being stolen. And there's no stories about her resilience, her capacity to make a life for herself, her high intelligence, her capacity to negotiate a life for herself. That is meaningful in her own traditional terms, and that is deserving of our respect and admiration. And so I've really set myself the task of refiguring her in the public consciousness, not as a tragic figure at all, but that is a remarkable colonial figure, should be as powerful in our imagination as Ned Kelly, and in the way that we don't regard Ned Kelly as a murderous horse thief in our public imagination. We should not just relegate Truganini to being the tragic last Tasmanian, because A, she wasn't the last Tasmanian, and B, she wasn't a tragic figure at all. So I think at that point I would be interested, I can talk some more, I love to talk, but I would be interested in seeing whether anybody's got questions to ask me.
We do have a couple of questions, but before I go to the audience questions, I was actually really interested in the kind of research that a book like this takes. So is it, how do you go about doing the research for a story which is this, difficult to kind of piece together?
Well, luckily, I've been doing this for quite a long time, because I've worked for a long time in recovering stories of people who've just been written out of history or lost to history altogether, mostly African-American slaves, enslaved African-Americans, possibly tracking them through, very minuscule records in tiny places. And I was very lucky that I had 2 ARC professorial fellowships that allowed me to do this kind of extraordinary work, but also gave me the skills to do it, and the wherewithal to know that if you hunt in archives, you will find things that will give you clues to the stories that you're looking for. And that, so what I set myself, the task I set myself is, don't pay any attention to what other people have said about this. Go right back and find people who saw her with their own eyes, who heard her with their own ears, and luckily wrote it down and hopefully wrote it down close enough to the time for it to be trustworthy. Now, that's not very many people, but it is definitely George Augustus Robinson, whose journals are huge. I mean, they fill a book that's that thick. And as well as that, there are other odd people who write letters to the newspapers or who appear in official reports, especially in the later years of her life when she's basically a prisoner of the state at Oyster Cove, which is just down the road from where I live. There are reports from the people who are government employees there about her. And so I'm able to create a life that I think is trustworthy, not rely on the kind of self-serving mythology, is very self-serving, that developed about her from the moment she was close to dying, and there was a recognition that she was going to be the last. And she isn't just the last of the Nuenonne, she's the last of a group of people that the British scientific establishment had decided were the missing link. So the Tasmanians were very special. And so she's seen as the last of them. And suddenly they pay a lot of attention to her once she's dead. But the attention that they pay to her once she's dead is very suspect. I don't believe most of the stories that people tell about her after she's dead. And so my antenna for, self-serving narratives that serve a particular story about all these poor, unfortunate people who were just, close to Neanderthal man and couldn't possibly survive in the modern world is not true. And it's not a narrative that I'm interested in. So it's trying to come up with a new narrative based on, as much as possible, some real hard kind of evidence about how she was living and what she was doing. If I had not had George Augustus Robinson's journals, I couldn't have done it. It's as simple as that. But he gave me the capacity to see this woman in the Tasmanian landscape over a long period of time, 13 years. And in the Tasmanian Victorian landscape, because she went with him to Victoria as well. And so this is the bulk of my book, is the young woman, whom I can really see. And so I haven't got footnotes. I don't like footnotes. I'm very pleased to be released from having to write books that have got footnotes in them. I list all my sources, and what I say to people is, if you want to dispute with me this interpretation, you'll have to go and do the research yourself, and then we can talk about it. But I'm not going to have Keith Winchapel or somebody like that going through my footnotes with malicious intent.
We have a question about the Robinson connection. From Anna Johnson, who asks...
Oh, hello, Anna.
Hi, Cassandra. What did you discover about the relationship between Robinson and Truganini? And I'm wondering how your archival research corrects Vivian Ray Ellis's version.
Yeah. Well, I am very firmly of the view, from having read Robinson very, very closely, and also people who knew him, that he did not have a sexual relationship with Truganini. I think, again, that's part of the sort of easy narrative of the Indigenous woman who's travelling with a European man. I mean, it's the Pocahontas story, you know, it's the easy story. I don't think that Robinson would ever have had a sexual relationship with her, because the role he set for himself is much more intimate than that. The role he set for himself is to be her father and protector and saviour. And also is terrified of the fact that she was carrying venereal disease, as all the Aboriginal women were, and he didn't want to catch it. You know, I just see no evidence for it at all. I think it's just lazy, like what Vivian Ray Ellis has done, and she's done it but for those who don't know, this woman wrote a self-published biography of Truganini back in the 1970s. And I think that while she has done a lot of very impressive archival research, she nevertheless had a very fixed idea in her mind about the story she wanted to tell. And the story that what she wanted to tell was that Truganini was both a betrayer of her people and also a kind of a victim of George Augustus Robinson, in that she was, you know, he had seduced her, or she was his mistress or something. There's no evidence to support that on either count, in my view. And I'm very strong about the fact that I don't like that narrative, and I wish to have it removed from the historical discourse. I think it has no credibility whatsoever.
We've got another question about George, actually. So what do you think made George so enlightened towards Aboriginal people, unusually for his time anyway?
Yes, I ponder about George a lot, actually. He's a fascinating character, and his best instincts and his worst instincts are constantly in kind of battle with one another. His best instincts are very good for his time. There's no doubt about that. Once he gets out into the wilderness, the Tasmanian wilderness, he basically, the term I think for it these days is goes native. He basically becomes like the Aboriginal people that he's travelling with. He doesn't take his clothes off, but he dances at their corroborees, he eats their food, he hunts with them, he avidly listens to their stories, he learns their languages. And he just loves being out there in the wilderness. He's an amazing man in that I mean, if anybody who's walked the Southwest Track in Tasmania knows what we're talking about, the kind of, or seen the movie The Nightingale is another, I'd give you an idea about what it was to be in the Tasmanian bush at that time. And he loves it. It really makes his Puritan spirit soar to be out there in that landscape. And these people are so at ease in this world and have such mastery over it that he's in awe of them, really. And this is him doing constant battle with his Christian belief that he's God's messenger and that his role is to bring them to God, to save them for God. And these two things are in constant kind of trouble in his mind. But he's almost unique in that he sees them as not less than himself, and he certainly doesn't see them as vermin, which is what a lot of people in Tasmania did at that time. But at the same time, he sees them as God's lost children, and that it's his job as a good father to bring them to God. And I think it's a terrible shock to him to realise that God would allow them all to die. His belief that if he can bring them to God, they will be saved in every respect, spiritually saved and saved from extinction, is deeply shattered when he gets to Flinders Island and where people are just dying all around him. And he understands that it's not going to work. And that the betrayal, huge betrayal of them in taking them to this offshore island when he promised to secure land for them and look after them and allow them to live their traditional lives and all of these other lies he told them, that he justified this to himself because he was going to turn them into Christians and that they would be saved for God. But in fact, they weren't being saved for God. They were dying without being Christianized, which, of course, to somebody who was an evangelical Christian was a terrible fate because they would be consigned to, hell, presumably. And that they weren't being saved either metaphorically, spiritually, or physically. And that was a terrible blow to him. And when he gets to Victoria and he's really overwhelmed by the tragedy that's happening to the Victorian clans, he has a sense that he kind of abandons them. He, particularly Truganini, she's disappointed him by not behaving the way he wants her to. And he basically loses that sense of deep emotional connection to everyone except the old man known as Waridi. The others have disappointed him. They've run away from him. They won't be loyal to him. And he's, given up on them. But at the same time, for a man in the 19th century, he's quite remarkable, I think, in the way in which he responds to Aboriginal people.
And that The Nightingale is an amazing film as well. So it was interesting that you...
Well, it was wonderful to see The Nightingale because, I was watching what I was writing about, that amazing landscape. I don't know where she shot it, actually. I must write to her and ask her about it. But that sense of, that overwhelmingly powerful landscape and the way in which the Aborigines negotiate their way through it. And he would have been dead in days if it wasn't for the fact that he had those people with him. And he understood that. He understood that his relationship to them was essential. But what he didn't understand was that the message that he gave them was, I'm becoming one of you. I'm with you. And he would say things like that to them. But, you can trust me. I'm one of you. I'm with you. But actually, what he was intending to do was to make them with him. He was going to make them into him. And they didn't understand that until the very last minute when he took them to Flinders Island. They didn't understand that they weren't going to be living in the Tasmanian wilderness for the rest of their days and that he would be with them and they'd have to put up with him, But they had observed him taking all these other clans away, but they thought it wouldn't happen to them, and it did.
There's another question about Robinson, and it was, Joss Benner has said, how did you get hold of his journals?
Well, luckily, they've been transcribed quite some time ago by a remarkable, diligent, self-taught historian, really, a man called NJB Plomley, who was for a long time the director of the Queen Victoria Museum in Launceston. And he was fascinated by Robinson for slightly different reasons than me, but nevertheless, he is a fascinating character. And he took it upon himself to transcribe these amazing diaries that were written out in the bush in the mizzling rain and so forth in this terrible handwriting. And so we have a record of readable published record which has then been upgraded more recently to a second edition of these journals, which have put back into the transcriptions what Plomley had left out. So I have compared various parts of the original to the transcriptions, and they're very, very good. And so I was able to read. I've got a very dog-eared copy of this book, but 2 copies of it. One's broken and the other one's not broken. So I can have one that's still intact because I've read it so many times, and it requires so many times looking at it and then looking at it again and then looking at it again. But it's a remarkable document, and I discovered it because my friend Linda Ryan, who wrote the book of the Aboriginal Tasmanians, was doing research for that book in Tasmania when I decided to come back here to live. And she said to me, your ancestor, Richard Pybus, was involved in the removal of the Aboriginal people from Tasmania. I went, oh, really? Like, and she said, you can read about him in George Augustus Robinson's journals. And I went, what's that? And so she handed me this copy of this great big fat book called The Friendly Mission. And I started reading it. It literally turned my life around. It was an extraordinary thing to read. And I had no notion of myself as a writer at that point. And out of that came my first book, Community of Thieves. And I've been kind of wrestling with George Augustus Robinson ever since. And I think I would go to my grave still puzzling about George Augustus Robinson. But I didn't want to write a book about George Augustus Robinson, you understand? I wanted to write a book about Truganini because she's the one. Yeah. She's the one to pay attention to.
Well, Emma Kate Rose asks, would you describe the story of Truganini's ability to survive and thrive as a feminist story?
Well, yeah, I think I'd have to. I've never thought about putting those kinds of late 20th century concepts onto her. I must say she's, I think some feminists would have difficulty with some of the strategies that she uses to survive, mostly flattering white men and flirting with them and having sex with them. But nevertheless, she doesn't ever she doesn't become their plaything. She doesn't become their pet. She doesn't become their whore. Despite the fact that Peter Conrad once described her as a white man's doxy, which I thought was fine for, an intellectual Tasmanian. It says something about Peter Conrad. But her relationships with white people, most of whom are men, but not entirely so. She has a number of white women friends. Her relationships with white people are transactional at all times. So I'll give you something in return for. Okay. And that's basically how she negotiates. Now, that may not be a feminist strategy. So I'm not sure that I'd be comfortable with that term, actually, in relation to her. I think she's her own woman. I think we could be very clear about that. Yeah.
We've got, and also, yeah, I think someone else has said, depends on the feminist. And yes, I think getting your, learning what tools you have and using them to make your situation better is definitely, there's definitely a strength in that and a female ingenuity in that as well. So we have a question about the you grappling from Ali Lee. Did you or have you grappled with any ethical dilemmas during the writing or the release of this book?
I think we always have ethical dilemmas when we put books into the public domain, particularly non-fiction writers. I think perhaps the dilemma that I grappled with was that some people in the First Nations community would be offended that I had written about Truganini, or that I had somehow perpetuated a narrative that the Aboriginal community in Tasmania wished to be shot of, which is the last narrative, the extinction narrative. And there is an ethical dilemma about that. And the other, because the thing is, I said it before, whilst I want to celebrate the resurgence of Aboriginality in Tasmania, I'm not going to turn away from the genocide. I'm not going to turn away from the fact that an entire people, an entire way of life was destroyed in a very short period of time. You can't turn away from that. That there were survivors who became part of it, who were transformed into another culture, into another way of life, into a form of slavery to white men, and that their children became part of another kind of community, but it was not the Aboriginal world that existed here in the early 19th century, that was extinguished by deliberate government policy. So I have been aware that in emphasizing that terrible apocalyptic moment in history, some people will think that I'm feeding a narrative that they don't want to hear. But although nobody's made that criticism to me. The other thing is that at Oyster Cove, which is where the last of the clans were taken after they closed Flinders Island because it was costing the government too much money, and they took them down to an abandoned convict station just down the road from where I live at Oyster Cove, which would have been abandoned because it was too unhealthy for convicts to live there. And they were basically abandoned there, and they lived in terrible squalor and awash with alcohol and sexual exploitation, and generally it was horrendous. And writing about that world down there raised the same ethical issues that I know a number of anthropologists faced in the 1980s and 1990s about writing about Aboriginal communities and the sexual violence and problems in Aboriginal communities that really it's not pretty, but it's what dispossession looks like. And I felt that I had to write about it. I had the documentation about it, about a huge amount of abuse that was going on down there, and the terrible drinking and violence and sexual violence and other kinds of. And it was dreadful, and the idea that somehow, which is part of the narrative, they just were put down there and they just faded away. There was no fading away going down at Oyster Cove. It was dreadful. And I felt that whilst I don't linger on it, I don't spend a lot of time on it, it was something that I did need to say. And then I did get some pushback about William Lanny, who was the last Tasmanian male, who was a very violent drunk and who bashed his women companions, who were Truganini and a woman known as Paddy Clark. And I'm not supposed to say those things, I think, but I did. So that's an ethical dilemma that I spent some time wrestling with and decided that William Lanny had a terrible life, and he was a boy. He went on whaling ships and he was a terrible drunk, and alcohol made him do terrible things. It doesn't, take away from the man's humanity.
We've got a couple of other questions here. So one of them is actually about the fish. Do you know whether the people down there ate scaly fish or not? Is that?
They didn't.
They what, sorry? The
Nuenonne people, the people of southeastern Tasmania, did not eat scalefish. Absolutely not. They regarded it with revulsion. There's a lot of documented evidence of that. Why they did, I don't know. But since they had abalone, scallops, crayfish, oysters, I guess they didn't really need to eat scalefish. It's quite interesting that when the first explorers came, they saw their failure. A maritime people who didn't fish with hooks, they thought, was the supreme example of mental deficiency. The fact that they didn't need to eat scalefish, they weren't interested in eating scalefish, was beside the point. They themselves didn't eat abalone, oysters, crayfish, all those delicious things. They ate scalefish, these Europeans, and so they thought the fact that these dark-skinned people didn't eat scalefish meant they were mentally deficient. But when they get to the west coast, the northwest coast, they did eat fish, and so it's not a universal thing in Tasmania.
Right. Very jealous of people who are isolating next to oyster farms, I have to admit.
Yeah, there's plenty of oysters to eat. And crayfish, because they can't sell them to China, so they're selling crayfish along the side of the road at the moment. Mind you, still have to pay a lot of money for it.
Wish I'd gone down to Tasmania before the lockdown. Anyway, we have a question here saying, looking back on the saviour mentality of George and putting aside the genocide, how has your own journey with Indigenous culture that grips you so much informed how we should address land rights and sovereignty in the future? So that was there's a bit missing in the middle of that sentence, but I think, how has your journey with looking at Indigenous culture?
Well, what I say at the end of my book is, what happened in Tasmania happened everywhere. It just was more complete here. And every one of us who are the descendants of immigrants or immigrants ourselves have to take some responsibility for the fact that we live on stolen land, and that our life and our economic well-being is dependent on the brutal dispossession of Indigenous people and generations of callous indifference and institutional racism. And we all therefore need to ask ourselves, what is owed? What do we owe for this? I mean, we are managing this COVID-19 crisis remarkably well compared to other places in the world. We are regarded to be the richest nation in the world. We are blessed. We live in grace in this country, white people, and most white people. And I think it is, we have to take responsibility for how we got to this point. And I think one of the first things that we could do is listen to what Indigenous people say they tell us that they want. And if they say that they want to be treated with respect, and if they say that they want and need to be recognised as the First Nations of this country, and if they say that they want to have an Indigenous voice to Parliament, what kind of mean-spirited people would deny them that?
Interesting. We've got another question here about Truganini's female companions. Was there any information about women that she was connected to?
Yeah. There were, during the high point of the period that I'm talking about, she travelled with a number of men and women. And she had close friendships with a number of Indigenous women. All of whom died considerably earlier than she did. So she had good female friendships. There was no question about that. And Tanga Natura, for example, who is the ancestor of a large number of people who make up the Tasmanian Aboriginal community in the southern part of Tasmania, was a very close friend of hers. And her daughter, Fanny Smith, was somebody that Truganini used to walk from Oyster Cove into the Huon Valley to visit, and her children remembered her and remembered the stories and songs that she sang. I know this because they were interviewed by Ernest Westlake, who was a British collector who came out looking for stories and artefacts and things about the Tasmanians at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. And he interviewed Fanny's children and grandchildren. And so they talked quite a bit about that and the relationship that Truganini had with their mother and their Indigenous grandmother. But it's quite clear from other things that people say that she had close female friendships, yeah.
There's a couple of other questions here. I'll just look back through it. One of them was a couple of comments. One of them's Keith Windshuttle is a wanker. We'll take that as a comment.
Not been heard of for a while.
Another one is reciprocity is an important part of Aboriginal culture, so perhaps Truganini's expectations were of reciprocity rather than a transaction, which is an interesting point.
Yeah, reciprocity, it was entirely part of the expectation that George Augustus Robinson's companions had. There's no question about that. But I think that I mean, I still see her as I still see her as engaged in transactional relationships. From, you know, that's something that she learned as a child. That was the way to get by. And I mean, she didn't have to go off to the whalers camps. She could have stayed and be fed and looked after by George Augustus Robinson. But she did go because that was a relationship that she was negotiating. She wasn't just the dependent, you know, subject. And so you see her make these you know, when she was sitting for her famous portrait and famous sculpture, she would sing for the sculptor and his wife, but in return for glasses of Madeira. And she was very clear about that. You know, I'll sing for you. Or she'd sing for them and say, okay, now give me a glass of wine. And, you know, that a lot of people's memory of her, what they write about her in letters where they say that they met her or that they knew her or that they were having dealings with her, have exactly these kinds of elements to them, which is, you have something that I want and I'll give you something that I know you're interested in return, right? So you could call it reciprocity or you could call it transactional. I think that is what it is. It isn't a matter of charity or pity. I mean, my family used to talk about the fact that they used to give her gifts of tea and sugar and stuff like that, and they seemed very proud of themselves for having done that. But you know, when she was walking across their farm, right? She was walking across their farm, and they very beneficently gave her tea and sugar and things, because she would just go up and demand it, and they would give it to her. I mean, most settlers in Tasmania were used to the fact that First Nations people would just demand things from them. And so they gave it. It's one of the things that happens when they go to Victoria. There's a lot of Tasmanians in Victoria, and the Tasmanians treat the Tasmanian settlers treat the Indigenous people from Tasmania quite differently. They understand that you've got to give them tea and sugar, and you have to, you know, let them run off with their dogs, and that a reciprocal relationship. Yeah, fair enough. Transactional, reciprocal. I don't really see there's that much difference between those two things.
There's a really nice sort of comment question to end on here, which is from Judy. Thank you for your insightful presentation of Truganini's life, leadership and story. What legacy are you hoping that your new book will have for us?
Well, we'll get rid of all of those maudlin myths about her for a start. We could start with having some decent signage about her in Tasmania, having some decent monument to her in Tasmania that isn't telling some kind of fanciful fiction about her, and a recognition in Australia generally that this is a major figure in our past and that she needs to be given due recognition, and also that the statues of the people who stole Aboriginal bones and displayed them in museums that are prominently displayed in Franklin Square, Sir John Franklin and Sir William Crowther, should have a plaque placed on the base of them to say that these men were grave robbers and despoilers of Aboriginal bodies.
I think that's a very good response, not to take the statues down, but to show the context, the context for them, and that we understand the history. So I think that's a really good suggestion, actually. And I suppose that's exactly what your book is doing in a way. It's
my intention. This is my intention, is to say, you know, this is not just the past. You know, my watchword in life is a quote from William Faulkner that people might be familiar with. Is the past is never dead. It's not even past.
Yeah, very good. I'm just sharing again the link to your book. with all our guests. So I've just shared that by chat. So if anybody wants to hop on and purchase that, we're still open for purchasing books, and certainly our shipping is going crazy at the moment. So if you need something to read in your isolation wherever you are, this might just be the ticket for you, I think. It's a beautifully, like, the photograph on the front of the book, as you said, is incredible.
You want to see a picture of her? I'll show you a picture. It's got great pictures in it, this book. The publishers have done me proud. But anyway, there she is. That's the famous Bock painting, except that it was mislabeled in Tasmania for a long time. That's the young woman.
Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. Well, look, just thank you so much for talking to us tonight, for beaming in from Tasmania with and leaving your oysters to one side. And people are sending messages in saying that they've read it, or that they know the areas in the book, and that they've really enjoyed your chat this evening. And
somebody asked me a question beforehand about the dog chain at Port Arthur. That didn't have anything to do with Aboriginal people. That was to keep convicts on the peninsula. Yeah.
Somebody did share a photograph before the event tonight. There's amazing how many people have, old family photographs of historical stuff back in Tasmania. My dad lives down there, and everyone he knows seems to have just little gems of information about the past, which is really interesting. Look, before we finish off tonight though, Cassandra, I'm going to unmute everyone, which will be a cacophony of people, maybe on phones with televisions in the background, children going crazy. So we'll end the event from there, but I'm going to unmute all, and we can then have a round of applause for Cassandra Pybus.
I haven't done anything like this before.
Taking a photograph of the
liaison.
It is.
I think I'm gone. So much.
That's creepy, isn't it? Going into people's
Yes, I think it's a bit.
We have many more events. I'm just going to go back to Cassandra. I'm not again.
Oh, that's nice.
Thanks for joining us.
It's fairly